Welcome, esteemed colleagues. Our gathering today delves into the pervasive force of cognitive biases, those systematic errors of human cognition profoundly influencing our thoughts and behaviors. Our discourse shall explore their origins, implications, and the avenues for mitigation.
Indeed, Carl, it's imperative to begin by acknowledging that these biases are not mere errors, but rather deeply rooted in our unconscious mind. They serve a protective function for the ego, shielding us from the truths we dare not confront.
That's an interesting perspective, Sigmund. But let's not disregard the importance of empirical evidence. Cognitive biases, their manifestations, and underlying processes must be meticulously studied through introspection and experimental methodologies.
Both of you make compelling points. However, it's crucial to consider cognitive development's role in this matrix. Biases evolve as part of the natural progression of thought, influencing how children perceive and solve problems.
It's all about the environment, if you ask me. Biases are learned responses to stimuli that were perhaps beneficial in our evolutionary past. This behaviorist perspective cannot be overlooked, for it offers a path towards unlearning these biases through conditioning.
While each of you raises valid considerations, we must not underestimate the mechanics of classical conditioning in shaping these biases, especially in social contexts. Our reactions are often the result of deeply ingrained conditioned responses.
This rich tapestry of viewpoints sets the stage for our discussion. Let us delve deeper into these facets, understanding that our quest is not merely academic, but crucial for the amelioration of human understanding and society at large. Let us delve directly into the roots of cognitive biases in our psychic and evolutionary development. Sigmund, your insights?
Indeed. Cognitive biases, at their core, are nothing short of defense mechanisms. They shield our ego from the truths too painful to bear, originating from the murky depths of our unconscious. It is in this darkness that our most primeval instincts reside, along with the biases that direct our decisions away from potential internal conflicts.
I must interject, Sigmund. Your focus on the unconscious as the sole source of cognitive biases seems to me overly reductive. We must not shy away from the utility of experimental psychology. Through systematic introspection and controlled examination, we can uncover the mechanisms behind these biases. Our cognitive apparatus doesn't merely act as a shield, it actively constructs our perception of reality.
Wilhelm, while your point stands, we should not overlook the developmental perspective. Cognitive biases are not static. They evolve through various stages of intellectual growth. In children, for instance, these biases are essential in developing problem-solving skills. They're not simply errors in judgment, but steps towards higher forms of reasoning.
Your discussions dance around the periphery. Bias is the residue of behavioral conditioning. Our environment rewards certain modes of thought, reinforcing these so-called biases, which in turn influence our future actions. They are not born from within, but imprinted upon us by the world.
Skinner, you view the human psyche too much like a passive recipient of external stimuli. The intrinsic desires and fears within us shape how these biases form and how they're reinforced. Our internal world is as much a player in this dance as the external.
Gentlemen, let us not diverge too far into our theoretical divides. It is clear that cognitive biases, whether they stem from the unconscious as Sigmund suggests, the developmental stages John focuses on, Wilhelm's introspection, or Skinner's conditioning, play a significant role in our survival and decision-making. They might indeed serve a purpose, whether protective, adaptive, or both. Let us proceed by considering how these biases influence our social perceptions and interactions. We now turn our attention to how cognitive biases shape our social perceptions and the stereotypes we hold. Sigmund, would you care to begin?
Indeed, Carl. It's quite unavoidable that our libidinal desires and the mechanisms we employ to fend off anxiety sculpt our biases in social perception. The ego, in its quest for gratification, projects its own unacceptable desires onto others, thus manufacturing social stereotypes that serve its purpose.
Your insistence on the primacy of these so-called unconscious desires seems to me, Sigmund, a bit of a stretch. Conditioning and the stimuli we are exposed to play a far more tangible role. The environment shapes our perceptions, teaching us through repetition who to trust and who to fear, leading to stereotypes.
Ivan, while your point on environmental conditioning cannot be dismissed, we must not overlook the stages of cognitive development. Children do not simply absorb stereotypes. They construct their understanding of social roles and behaviors through active engagement with their environment. Their biases evolve as they progress through different stages of cognitive and moral development.
I find the focus on unconscious desires and the stages of development fascinating, but lacking in empirical veracity. Our behaviors, including those related to social perception and stereotyping, are the result of conditioning, yes, but more precisely, they are the outcomes of reinforcements and punishments. Stereotypes persist because in some ways, they have been reinforced within societal structures.
Skinner, you talk of reinforcements as if the psyche were a simple mechanism of pulleys and levers. You dismiss the complexity of human emotion and the unconscious forces that drive us.
Gentlemen, please. Our aim here is to shed light on the matter, not to overshadow it with our quarrels. Sigmund, while your psychoanalytic approach provides deep insight, we cannot ignore the behavioral aspects that Skinner and Ivan bring to the table, nor the developmental stages Jean emphasizes. Each perspective contributes to a fuller understanding of how cognitive biases in social perception and stereotyping come to be.
Carl, my observations are rooted in experimental evidence. It is through conditioning, through repeated associations, that these biases are learned. This is an empirical fact, not mere conjecture.
Nevertheless, Ivan, the child's mind is not a blank slate. The cognitive structures they develop profoundly influence how they interpret these associations and the biases they form.
And yet, if we change the environmental conditions, if we alter the reinforcements, can we not also change these biases? This is where the practical application of our theories must come into play.
It's clear that our social perceptions and the stereotypes we hold are not shaped by a single factor, but are the result of complex interplay among our unconscious desires, environmental conditioning, cognitive development, and behavioral reinforcements. Each of your theories offers a piece of the puzzle. Let us now proceed, bearing in mind the multifaceted nature of cognitive biases. We'll now address the fascinating interplay between cognitive biases and memory. How do our biases shape our recollections, and what implications does this have?
Let us consider, gentlemen, the structure of our mental processes. Memory, as I've studied, is not a mere recording device. It's susceptible to bias. Our introspection shows us that events are colored by perceptions at the moment of encoding. Our very methodologies unmask the influence of biases on these encoded memories.
Wilhelm, you skirt around the crux of it. It's the unconscious forces at work, shielding us from truths too painful to bear, that mold our memories. Our desires, our fears, these are the craftsmen of our recollections. Repression is not a simple bias. It is a sentinel guarding the gates to the unconscious.
Such dramatization, Sigmund. Our memories are but behaviors, reinforced or diminished over time. What you term repression, I see as a failure of reinforcement, a forgetfulness when a memory yields no significance or reward. Our biases towards certain memories stem from their utility, their ability to aid our survival in our environment.
Both of you seem to overlook the stage of cognitive development. A child does not have the same facilities for memory as an adult. Their biases in memory formation are fundamentally different, evolving as they progress through stages of cognitive development. Their understanding of the world shapes what they remember and how they recall it.
But Jean, isn't this precisely the point? Our methods allow for the dissection of these stages to see the biases at work. Without methodical introspection, how do we differentiate between development and distortion?
Introspection? Your methods, Wilhelm, scratch merely the surface. The depth of human psyche, its conflicts and resolutions in the unconscious, elude your so-called systematic study.
Enough, Sigmund. We must look at the empirical evidence. Memories are shaped by the consequences of our actions, by the reinforcement of society's norms, and by the repetition of behaviors. This is observable, measurable.
And yet, Skinner, you ignore the internal developmental mechanisms at play. The child does not simply respond to reinforcement, but actively constructs their understanding, their memory of events, through their interactions with the world.
A spirited debate indeed. Our biases, whether ingrained by our unconscious desires, shaped by environmental reinforcements, or constructed through our developmental interactions with the world, play a crucial role in how we remember. Our memories, it seems, are as much a reflection of ourselves as they are of the events we recall. Let's delve into how cognitive biases color our moral and ethical judgments. Sigmund, you maintain that biases influence the eternal conflict between our base desires and societal norms?
Precisely, Carl. Our moral decisions are frequently a masquerade of the id's desires, clashing with the superego's dictates. Biases are but the psyche's attempt to veil this eternal struggle, shaping our ethical judgments to appease internal conflicts rather than adhere to external moralities.
Interesting point, Sigmund. Jean, do you believe cognitive development stages play a role in this ethical conundrum?
Undoubtedly, Carl. As our cognitive structures evolve, so too does our capacity for moral reasoning. Children, for instance, exhibit biases towards egocentrism, which heavily influences their sense of justice and fairness. Only through developmental progress can individuals transcend these biases, though not all do, leading to flawed ethical judgments in adulthood.
But Jean, you overlook the potency of the unconscious in shaping these very biases you speak of.
On the contrary, Sigmund acknowledging the influence of the unconscious does not negate the developmental pathway towards overcoming such biases.
Gentlemen, please. Ivan, does conditioning play a role in this?
It does, Carl. Through conditioning, societal norms and moral codes become internalized. Yet, cognitive biases can result from conditioned responses too, leading to ethical judgments that are more a product of reinforcement history than rational deliberation.
Ivan, I must interject. You're hinting at it. Let me make it clear. Our environment shapes our behavior through reinforcement and punishment, biases included. We're not free from our history of reinforcement, which muddles our ethical decision-making. Understanding this can help us modify undesirable biases.
Wilhelm, your thoughts?
The key to understanding moral and ethical judgments is rooted in introspection. Cognitive biases, while challenging to discern, distort our ethical reasoning. A systematic and rigorous study into these biases can illuminate the foundations of our moral dilemmas.
A task easier said than done, Wilhelm. The complexities of the human psyche ensure that some biases remain veiled, inaccessible even to the most persistent introspection.
Indeed, the debate around cognitive biases and ethical judgment exemplifies the intricate interplay between our internal motives and societal dictates. Thank you, panelists, for a stimulating discussion. We now delve into the critical issue of cognitive biases in clinical psychology, their role in diagnosis and patient treatment. We must scrutinize our own biases as clinicians. Skinner, how do you perceive these biases within behavioral analysis?
The very framework of behavioral analysis presupposes an objective stance. Yet, we cannot deny that our interpretations are tinted by personal experiences. If a therapist expects a certain behavior, their interventions might just reinforce that very behavior, not the patient's actual needs.
Precisely, Skinner. But let us not forget, developmental stages greatly influence how patients understand and narrate their experiences. A child, for instance, cannot express their thoughts and emotions in the same way an adult does. Misinterpreting such expressions due to our biases can lead to incorrect diagnoses.
But gentlemen, you underestimate the depth of the psyche. Our biases are not mere misinterpretations, but deeply rooted in our unconscious. The patient-analyst dynamic is a battlefield of transferences and countertransferences. Diagnoses and treatments are thus profoundly influenced by these unconscious biases.
Sigmund, what you describe as the depth of the psyche could well be explained by learning histories and reinforcement patterns. No need for an unconscious battlefield. Skinner, Freud, your debate underscores the importance of introspection in clinical practice. We must constantly question our interpretations and judgments, rigorously analyzing the roots of our biases. Only through such methodical introspection can we aspire to achieve diagnostic accuracy.
Wilhelm, while introspection is crucial, one cannot overlook the stages of cognitive development. Our understanding of a patient's condition is mediated by our cognizance of their developmental level. The biases in our diagnostic frameworks often arise from misaligning these levels with adult standards of rationality.
And let us not overlook the simple mechanisms of conditioning. A therapist's biases can condition the patient's responses, leading to a skewed view of the patient's condition based on the therapist's expectations and reinforcements.
It's evident our understanding of cognitive biases in clinical psychology is multifaceted, drawing from deep psychological analysis, behavioral patterns, developmental stages, and methodical introspection. Our challenge lies in not only recognizing these biases, but actively working to mitigate their impact. Sigmund, you have long argued that the mind is a battleground of conflicting forces. Could cognitive dissonance be viewed as a manifestation of this inner conflict?
Indeed, Carl. The dissonance one experiences is nothing but the mind's attempt to reconcile opposing forces. This tension is an inherent feature of our psychic machinery, where desires clash with societal norms, where the ID battles the superego. Cognitive biases in this light can be seen as the mind's defense mechanisms to reduce discomfort, to maintain psychic equilibrium.
Wilhelm, from your foundational perspective on introspection, how do you dissect the psychological conflict brought forth by cognitive dissonance?
Our internal perception, meticulously analyzed, reveals cognitive dissonance as a disturbance in our conscious experience. This is not a mere psychic skirmish as Sigmund proposes, but a methodological problem in our psychological apparatus. Through introspection, we can identify these biases and address the root of the dissonance.
Wilhelm, your so-called methodological approach underestimates the unconscious depths of our psyche. Introspection skirts around the actual tumult within.
And your focus on the unconscious perhaps attributes too much to it, missing the cognitive restructuring happening in the conscious field.
Both of you overlook the developmental essence of cognitive dissonance. It is through the stages of cognitive development that one encounters and resolves dissonances. This is not merely a psychic battle nor a methodical error, but a necessary part of intellectual growth. As children face new information that conflicts with their current understandings, they adapt. This is the essence of cognitive dissonance, serving as a driver for development.
Let us not dive too deep into abstractions. Cognitive dissonance, from a behaviorist standpoint, is simply a discrepancy between actions and beliefs leading to an uncomfortable state. This discomfort is a form of negative reinforcement, prompting the individual to change either their behavior or their belief to reduce the inconsistency. Bias, in this context, is a learned response that can be unlearned or replaced with more adaptive behaviors through conditioning.
Ivan, your research on conditioning bears relevance. How do you perceive cognitive dissonance within the paradigm of conditioned responses?
Cognitive dissonance, in my view, Carl, is a disturbance in the organism's equilibrium caused by conflicting conditioned stimuli. It is less about psychic conflicts or developmental stages and more about the basic principles of learning. An organism learns to adapt its responses in order to restore balance, a process not dissimilar to the behaviorist perspective Skinner outlines, albeit I believe it is more deeply rooted in the physiological reactions to conflicting stimuli.
Fascinating insights. It's clear our understanding of cognitive biases and dissonance is enriched by viewing them through the prism of our varied perspectives. Let's delve into the influence of cognitive biases on educational processes. Jean, would you initiate our discussion on this matter?
Indeed, Carl. You see, cognitive biases profoundly affect our learning styles and the assimilation of knowledge. During the various stages of cognitive development, children might develop a predisposition to favor certain types of information over others, effectively limiting their capacity for critical thinking.
I must interject, Jean. While developmental stages are important, it's the conditioning processes that primarily shape learning biases. It's our interaction with the environment and the reinforcements we receive that guide our learning tendencies, not some predetermined cognitive evolution. Both of you touch on critical points, yet overlook the methodological accuracy necessary for understanding these biases. Introspection, thorough and systematic, could illuminate how biases ensnare the learner's mind, skewing both perception and comprehension of material.
Wilhelm, your faith in introspection is quaint, but you underestimate the unconscious forces at play. The familial pressures, the repressed desires, they all interfere with the learning process, distorting the educational outcomes far more than your introspective method could unveil.
Sigmund brings us to an intriguing point. The unconscious mind indeed dictates much of our behavior. But I wonder, how can we mitigate these biases to foster an educational environment that promotes genuine understanding?
By modifying behavior, Carl. If we systematically alter reinforcement schedules in the learning environment, we can steer the learners away from biases. This is not theory, it is practical application of behavioral principles.
And yet, Skinner, without addressing the developmental stages and the inherent biases each stage presents, your modifications may fall short. Education must adapt to the cognitive capabilities of the learner, encouraging critical thinking at every stage.
I find the lack of discipline in this conversation distressing. A rigorous, empirical approach is the only way to cut through these biases. Without it, we're merely speculating in the dark.
Your emphasis on methodology is noted, Wilhelm, but let us not disregard the impact of conditioned responses. Learning is not only about what happens internally, but also about how external stimuli, systematically applied, can influence and potentially mitigate biases.
This idealistic talk of mitigating biases through education overlooks the essential truth that our biases are rooted deeply in our psyche, shaped by forces beyond the conscious mind. Education, no matter how strategically structured, can only do so much in the face of the unconscious.
A spirited debate indeed. It appears that while our methodologies and understandings differ, we converge on the notion that cognitive biases present a formidable challenge in education. As we navigate this complex terrain, let us remember the importance of interdisciplinary effort in unraveling and addressing these biases. Our next topic awaits. Now let's delve into decision-making under uncertainty and how heuristics and biases intertwine in this process. Even, your thoughts?
Decision-making amidst uncertainty invariably harks back to our conditioned responses. These heuristics, though rudimentary, streamline our decision-making process. Yet they are double-edged swords, often leading us astray due to ingrained biases.
Ivan, while conditioning plays a role, we cannot overlook the stages of logical development. Children, for instance, exhibit a form of egocentrism in early stages that skews their decision-making. As they mature and their cognitive ability develops, they start to overcome these biases, albeit not entirely.
The environment sets a stage where certain behaviors are reinforced over others, leading to a skewed perception of outcomes. Our history of reinforcements under uncertain conditions shapes our decisions, often leading us to leap before we look.
You all seem to dance around the core issue. Our unconscious desires and fears profoundly influence our decisions. Under uncertainty, these forces are magnified, leading us to choices that might seem irrational but are deeply rooted in our psyche.
Sigmund, while the unconscious mind indeed plays a role, we must also consider the psychic energy involved in individuation. The process of understanding oneself deeply influences decision-making, pushing us toward choices that align more closely with our individual path, despite the biases.
All these perspectives offer insight, yet it becomes clear that we ought to approach the study of decision-making with a systematic methodology. Introspection, when properly harnessed, can unravel the biases lurking within our decisions, offering a path to clearer thinking.
Rigorous as that may sound, Wilhelm, it presupposes a level of introspective accuracy that's often clouded by the very biases we seek to unearth.
Furthermore, Jean, the very notion of introspection as a clear path is flawed. What we need is an objective analysis of behavior under different environmental contingencies to truly understand decision-making.
And yet, your supposed objective analysis undervalues the internal stimuli, the conditioned responses that occur without external prompts. Our decision-making under uncertainty is as much about internal conditioning as it is about external reinforcement.
Indeed, Ivan. The interplay between external realities and our internal world forms the crux of our decisions. To ignore the whispers of the unconscious is to navigate a ship in fog, without a compass.
A spirited debate, indeed. It's clear that understanding decision-making, especially under uncertainty, requires a comprehensive approach, incorporating internal motivations, developmental stages, conditioned responses, and behavioral reinforcements. Our biases, then, are the lenses through which we view the uncertain world, shaped by a complex interplay of psychological forces. Our discourse now veers towards the effect of cognitive biases on interpersonal relationships and communication. We begin with the notion of projection. Sigmund, your thoughts?
Projection. An exquisite defense mechanism. Individuals often see in others what they cannot tolerate in themselves, leading to a skewed interpretation of others' words and deeds. This bias, it corrodes relationships, fostering misunderstanding and conflict.
It's intriguing how you tie biases to defensive mechanisms. Skinner, does behaviorism offer a different lens?
Indeed, Carl. We observe communication as a behavior shaped by historical reinforcements. Past experiences bias our interpretation of interactions. When one's history involves repeated reinforcement for a particular response, one is biased to expect that response even in differing contexts. It's not about internal conflicts, but observable behaviors.
Allow me to interject. The developmental approach offers another perspective. Social cognition evolves through stages, with biases in communication reflecting the individual's cognitive developmental stage. A child, for example, may not appreciate the perspective of another, not out of selfishness, but due to their developmental phase.
That's all very well, Jean, but you overlook the deeper, unconscious motivations at play. Our libidinal desires and aggressive instincts invariably color our communication, creating biases based on our most primal urges.
Conditioning plays a significant role. The stimuli we've been conditioned to respond to, often unconsciously, influence our perceptions of others. Biases in communications are therefore not merely a product of internal desire, but of conditioned responses to external stimuli.
It seems our biases stem from a melange of internal desires, developmental stages, and external conditioning. Wilhelm, where does introspection fit into this?
Introspection, if conducted systematically, can unearth the biases within. It demands rigorous self-examination, fostering an understanding of one's own prejudices, which can cloud communication. This awareness can be the first step in mitigating the pernicious effects of these biases. Wilhelm, while your emphasis on introspection is noteworthy, we must not disregard the importance of environmental factors. It's the interplay between individual learning history and environmental contingencies that shapes our biased behaviors in communication.
Each stage of cognitive development offers a new lens through which biases are filtered. Acknowledging this can lead to more effective communication strategies that are tailored to the cognitive abilities of individuals at different stages of development.
But you're all missing the fundamental point. Our unconscious minds harbor desires and fears that inevitably distort our perceptions of others, leading to biased communication. Without recognizing and addressing these unconscious biases, we cannot hope to truly understand one another.
It's clear that cognitive biases in communication spring from a complex interplay of individual psychology, developmental stages, and environmental factors. Recognizing these biases is crucial for improving interpersonal relationships and communication. Let us continue to explore these profound ideas as we progress. We find ourselves at the crux of our discussion: strategies for mitigating cognitive biases. Skinner, you champion behavior modification. How do you propose we adjust perception patterns?
The essence lies in the manipulation of environmental contingencies. By systematically rewarding behaviors that indicate a reduction in biased perception, we can, over time, reshape an individual's cognitive biases. This is not conjecture, but grounded in empirical evidence from behavioral experiments.
Your approach, Skinner, is rather reductionist, if I may. Cognitive development cannot be manipulated solely through reinforcement. My suggestion is more comprehensive. Education needs to inculcate critical thinking from a tender age, fostering a mindset that questions and analyzes rather than accepts unconditionally. This prepares the ground for an individual to confront and mitigate their inherent biases.
Pray, Jean, how do you propose to measure the effectiveness of your so-called comprehensive approach in real time? Behavior is observable, thought processes less so.
By evaluating the outcomes and the quality of decisions made by individuals. Critical thinking fosters greater awareness of one's biases, thereby influencing decision-making processes. It's not solely about observable behavior, but about fostering a mindset.
Both of you speak of long-term interventions, yet my proposition cuts to the heart of the matter more directly. A rigorous scientific approach to uncover biases through experimental introspection and methodical study can provide immediate clarity. If we know the enemy within, we can confront it.
Ah, Wilhelm, but you overlook the unconscious's power. Biases are deeply rooted in our psyche, intertwined with our desires and fears. Can your methodical study unveil the mysteries of the unconscious?
Sigmund raises an intriguing point. The unconscious mind does indeed play a significant role in shaping our biases. Wilhelm, how do you respond?
Experimental introspection, if properly conducted, can reveal the operations of the mind, including those influenced by the unconscious. It's a matter of method, not possibility.
And yet, you fail to acknowledge the resistance of the unconscious. It does not yield its secrets readily to the introspective prodding of the scientist.
Gentlemen, please. Our purpose is to explore mitigation strategies, not to belittle each other's approaches. I advocate for integrating shadow elements to achieve personal growth and minimize biases. Acknowledging and embracing the parts of ourselves we prefer to keep hidden can be transformative.
Carl, your approach, while noble in sentiment, lacks the empirical rigor necessary for widespread application.
Perhaps Skinner, but it addresses the holistic human experience beyond the scope of mere behavior modification.
Carl, your proposition touches on something profound. It aligns with the notion of bringing the unconscious to consciousness, a journey to the depths of the psyche.
Integration and education, then, appear as complementary forces. Empower the individual through knowledge and self-awareness.
Precisely, Jean. This roundtable, spirited as it may be, underscores the multifaceted nature of cognitive biases. Each perspective, each strategy brings us closer to understanding and mitigating the biases that cloud our judgment. As our roundtable draws to a close, let us revisit the essence and the pervasive influence of cognitive biases on human behavior. Our understanding, as diverse as our approaches, highlights the complex nature of the human psyche. Contributions?
Clearly, from our deliberations, cognitive biases are not mere errors in judgment, but deeply rooted in the psychic mechanisms of our mind. They emerge from our unconscious desires and fears, shaping our reality to protect ourselves from internal conflict. The acknowledgement of such biases is not an intellectual luxury, but a necessity.
While I appreciate the psychoanalytic perspective, we must not overlook the importance of empirical evidence. Our understanding of cognitive biases can only be enriched through systematic observation and experimentation. Until we delve into the mechanisms with scientific rigor, we shall tread on speculative ground.
Our discussions underscored the developmental perspective, highlighting how biases evolve as individuals progress through different stages of cognitive development. This provides a hopeful outlook, suggesting that as our cognitive faculties mature, there exists the possibility to mitigate the influence of these biases through education and self-awareness.
The importance of environmental factors in shaping our cognitive biases cannot be overstated. Through conditioning, we learn to respond to our environment in ways that may not always align with reality. Acknowledging this can significantly advance our efforts to understand and subsequently to correct these biases.
Conditioning indeed plays a crucial role. However, the reduction of cognitive biases to merely conditioned responses is an oversimplification. Our mental processes are complex and layered, necessitating a more nuanced approach that considers the intersection of biology, environment, and experience.
Oversimplification or not, the discourse here neglects the fundamental conflict within the human psyche. Without understanding the war raging between our desires and societal expectations, mediated by cognitive biases, we are but blind men groping in the dark.
Each perspective brought forth today, from the depths of the unconscious mind through the stages of cognitive development to the influence of our environment, illustrates the multifaceted nature of cognitive biases. It's evident that no single theory can encapsulate the entirety of this phenomenon. Our spirited debate has, I hope, shed light on the importance of interdisciplinary dialogues in unraveling the complexities of the human mind. As we conclude, let us remember the essence of what makes us human, our unending quest for understanding, tempered by the humility of knowing our limitations. Thank you, gentlemen, for a stimulating discussion.